Bonk's Adventure is a 2D platformer from 1989 that was released for the PC Engine in Japan, which is better known as the Turbografx 16 over here in the US. Developed by Red Company and Atlas, the game and its main character Bonk were originally envisioned as a mascot for NEC, the makers of the Turbografx. In fact, back in Japan, Bonk was even punnily named PC Genjin as a means to more closely brand him with the PC Engine. Similar to what Sega would try to accomplish with Sonic the Hedgehog, Bonk's Adventure was designed to showcase the power of the Turbografx 16 and to put Nintendo with its aging NES hardware to shame in the process. It also tried to position Bonk as a much cooler character that could drive circles around Nintendo and its mascot Mario, who seemingly had little bite when compared to NEC's prehistoric caveman. And at the time, critics seemed to love him. Entertainment Weekly even went as far as to state that Bonk's Adventure was the third best game available in 1991, placing the game just behind Sonic the Hedgehog and Super R-Type, but above games like The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros. 2, and the original Metroid. What followed was a long line of sequels, ports, and spin-offs for the game, making Bonk a fairly recognizable character amongst retro enthusiasts, but somehow also a fairly obscure one for those not as interested in playing older games. While I was familiar with the character of Bonk growing up due to seeing several of his games on the Wii Virtual Console, I'd actually classify myself as falling into the latter of the two aforementioned categories. I always kind of remembered Bonk as just being a character that was there and didn't really know that he was intended to be the Turbografx mascot until fairly recently. In fact, Bonk's Adventure was actually the first video game review I made almost exactly a year ago, before I ended up shelving the finished video to focus on some stuff I was going through. But I never stopped thinking about the character and have always wanted to give his franchise a second shot. After all, Bonk was a fairly well-known character back in the day, despite being on a console that not many Americans owned. His relative obscurity got me wondering whether or not that has anything to do with the quality of his games themselves, or if he just wasn't lucky enough to strike the American zeitgeist in the way that he needed to. But before we dive into Bonk's Adventure, I thought it'd be fun to do a little gaming question of the day. Have you ever heard of the Turbografx 16 before? And if you happen to have owned or played one in the past, what do you think of it? I've always loved the Turbografx 16, even though my experience with the console is very limited. The strongest memory I have of the Turbografx 16 is, as me from a year ago would put it, playing a redonkulous amount of military madness for it on the Wii Virtual Console. And with that said and done, I think it's time we answered whether or not Bonk's Adventure holds up. When I try to figure out whether or not a game holds up, I like to think that I'm trying to figure out whether or not the game was any good to begin with, as well as whether or not it does anything unique that makes it stand out from other titles of the era. And in that regard, I like to think that Bonk's Adventure performs fairly well. The game centers around Bonk as he quests to rescue Princess Za from the evil King Drool. His journey takes him through about 24 or so stages that are separated into a couple of levels and has him do everything from running, jumping on clouds, climbing waterfalls, and swimming, while also using his abnormally sized cranium to defeat enemies. His head is his primary means of attack in this game and can be used to headbutt opponents, attack from beneath, spin into them, or dive into them outright. And honestly, that's all pretty awesome. Each of these attacks have a time and a place to shine and do a great job of keeping the game and its relatively bare-bones premise from growing stale. I especially like Bonk's dive attack, as it reminds me of that one Ralph Wiggum meme from The Simpsons. But this game also has a lot more to it than beating the Simpsons to dive bombs. Bonk can transform into angrier, more powerful versions of himself by eating meat that's hidden throughout levels and in enemies. This allows him to transform into one of two powered-up states that gives him the ability to stun his opponents, as well as grant him temporary invincibility, respectively. He also comes armed with 3 hearts that allow him to take damage from enemies before dying, can take a free hit when he's powered up, and can refill his health by eating food that he finds. On top of that, Bonk's Adventure has a very forgiving live system, as dying doesn't send Bonk to the beginning of a stage or a checkpoint, but rather leads to him respawning in the exact spot he perished in. And the game also has unlimited continues. So yeah, he's got a lot going for him, and honestly, it makes the game an utter delight to play. Thinking contextually, I can see why critics were so enamored with the character back in the day, as even though this game would eventually get a very belated NES port, Bonk's Adventure feels like an experience that's a cut above what Nintendo players could get back in 1990. Obvious graphical leap aside, the game features more on-screen action than your typical NES game, less slowdown and flicker than you'd expect off an 8-bit CPU, and slightly more varied gameplay than you may find on other non-Nintendo developed platformers on the aging NES. That's not to say that the game is perfect though, as it does have a few problems. For starters, I think that the game has a noticeable difficulty curve that creeps in around the 3rd or 4th level. It's not the worst by any stretch of the word, but it'll probably catch newer players off guard and be a little discouraging to younger or more casual players. The game also features several enemy types with hitboxes that feel a little unfair, such as crocodiles that can attack you from further away than you'd think they can, or smaller insect-based enemies that can be a little tricky to hit. However, it's worth mentioning that you can counter these enemies with the right attacks or avoid them outright, as combat isn't required to progress in the game. The only time you need to fight enemies in Bonk's Adventure is during boss battles, which are relatively self-explanatory pattern recognition challenges. They can sometimes get a little hectic, but thanks to the game's forgiving live system, can usually be dispatched with little to no difficulty if you want to use your remaining lives up steamrolling your opponent. This strategy doesn't work at the end of the game though, as there's a boss rush before the final boss that can be really difficult to get through with only a few lives. Getting through this challenge leads to another boss who has all of the previous boss's attacks, followed by a final boss fight to round out the game. This sudden flurry of boss battles comes out of nowhere and honestly is extremely frustrating due to it needing to be completed off a single continue. While Bonk's Adventure does have a noticeable difficulty curve up to this point, this sudden flurry of boss battles does little more than turn what was otherwise a pretty enjoyable experience into an extremely tedious one. I'll be honest, if it weren't for save states, I would have put this game away by now. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with a game suddenly ratcheting up the difficulty, but I also feel that it's somewhat flawed game design due to how out of left field it is. In the case of other difficult video games, that difficulty is usually sewn into the fiber of the game itself. The mechanics and difficulty of franchises like the NES Castlevania and Mega Man games are apparent from the opening minutes of the game, unlike in Bonk's Adventure where this game's design philosophy changes seemingly at the last minute. It's not enough to completely deter me from the game, but it's a shame because I was actually pretty invested in the game up to this point. While the Turbografx 16 was heavily marketed as the first 16-bit console in the US, that isn't necessarily true. The Turbografx was 16-bit in the sense that it had a 16-bit video color encoder and display controller, but its CPU was actually 8-bit, and as a result of that, I've always considered it more of a stopgap between something like the NES and Genesis in terms of performance. What this means for Bonk's Adventure is that while it looks 16-bit and features more colors and better performance than anything on the NES, the games for the system probably played a bit closer to NES or Master System titles than it did the Genesis or SNES. That's not to say that the system was weak or anything, but that it just wasn't quite as 16-bit as its name and marketing would have you believe. But that doesn't actually matter though, as the console had a ton of great looking and playing games for it. Plus, this game is frickin' gorgeous. It's got a great cartoony art style, and as far as showcases for the next generation of gaming go, I actually think that the large detailed sprites in Bonk's Adventure accomplish this spectacularly. The game's art style is playful and full of attitude, making use of the Turbografx hardware to the best of its ability. It kinda reminds me of the manga Dr. Slump for some reason, if I'm being honest. At any rate, the characters are all quite emotive and endearing in their design, and the world itself is colorful and makes use of the console's ability to display more colors than its 8-bit competition. In fact, if you compare this game to Bonk's Adventure for the NES, you can clearly see how much of an edge this version has over its demake. The Turbografx version simply has great sprite work and character design going for it, and it even has some parallax scrolling too for what it's worth. I will say that this game does have some great world building though, as in later levels of the game, you can actually notice a castle off in the distance, and sure enough, we actually get to explore that castle later in the game. Musically, Bonk's Adventure gets the job done, and not much else. I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing or that I didn't enjoy the musical offerings that this game had to offer though. I just also can't seem to remember much of the game's music outside of the first level theme off the top of my head. What I will say though is that the game showcases the Turbografx sound capabilities quite well over the NES. While nowhere near as robust as its later competition like the SNES and Genesis, the Turbografx 16 does feature more sound channels and higher quality audio than what you'd find on 8-bit consoles. While that's kind of a no-brainer, it does make me wonder how impressed consumers would have been by this improved audio, as well as the console's graphics back in the 1980s. This had to have been impressive at the time and had to have seemed like the next logical step forward for video game hardware. So does Bonk's Adventure hold up? Yes and no. While I do think that Bonk's Adventure is a good game that is aged particularly well and has a lot going for it, I also don't know if I'd go as far as to classify it as a must-play platformer. It does a lot right as a game, but I also feel like it doesn't do a superb enough job to make it stand out against other titles in the genre. That's not to say that I think you won't enjoy Bonk if you happen to give it a shot, I just think that there are other, better games out there for you to seek out. While I love the game's art style and also had a blast using Bonk's multiple methods of attack to fight off enemies, I just don't think there's enough going on for me with this game's level design and music to really consider this noteworthy. But one must also keep in mind the context of when this game came out. As one of the earlier 16-bit platformers on the market, there's no denying how stunning this game had to have looked when put up against stuff like Mario 3. It's just a shame that the game itself didn't do much more than look and sound prettier than the competition. If you find yourself hankering for a good platformer and want to give Mario and Sonic a rest though, Bonk's Adventure is a pretty fun game. Just one that's best admired with lowered expectations, and if you plan to beat it and aren't the best at platformers, access to save states for that boss rush. And with that said and done, that brings us to the end of this video. I'd love to hear what you guys think of Bonk's Adventure, as well as what other classic or forgotten platformers you think may be worth checking out. I'm always looking for new games to play, so seriously, feel free to drop a few game recommendations for me in the comments or over on my Twitter or Instagram. You could check those profiles out by following the link over in the description or by searching for NichePlays on those respective sites. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and that if you decide to give Bonk's Adventure a shot, you have a good time doing so. So yeah, bye.